Consider and take appropriate action regarding the water system study and water model performed by the Wallace Group. Jennifer?
Well, we have here with us tonight Kevin Glover and Gil. Gil did the water modeling, and I'm just going to turn it over to them for their presentation.
Do you prefer that we hold questions till you're finished, or do you want to field them as we have them?
We can take them as you have them if you want. I'm Gil Barnett with CP&Y and the Wallace Group, and I built the model and been working on the study and wanted to present to you some recommendations and findings of that tonight. So I'll just get started, and we can stop along the way and talk about things as we go if you'd like. I did complete the hydraulic model for the Trophy Club mud system, and I built the model as it currently exists and calibrated it to make sure we got the same pressures and flows as you do in the real system. After that, I added the future piping based on the areas where you're building houses and continue to develop, and added future demands for that and analyzed it into the peak future hourly demands and came up with recommendations for these following areas. First, the water supply from Fort Worth is a key concern. Right now you get the water through one 21-inch line from Westlake to Trophy Club, and we want to look at that. Elevated storage, we'll talk about that. Ground storage, and improving choke points in the system. I'll show you some graphs that show different points in the system that would be candidates for upgrades and changes. And then we'll talk about the pump station upgrades. This is just a picture of the model. Kind of hard to see. It's you can see the lines with the yellow lines and the green nodes of the model, and then just the aerial is the background, just kind of you can see where things are. This is with the aerial removed, just to show you the network. And you kind of see, I guess you can see my mouse. You got this eastern side and this western side are almost like two different systems. They are connected up here in the northeast and also at the pump station, but really they kind of act almost as two independent systems in a lot of ways. Before we get into the model, I just want to talk about some things, talk about conditions now and in the future. This population, I understand that's not the current population. We did this study based on data from 2010 to 2014. And during the 2010-2011 time period, that's when the population was that low. But these numbers were the demands during that time as well. So the 2.8 MGD average day and the 7 MGD max day were true for that population.
At what point in time? At what point in time?
2011 is when the population was about 9,800.
But we're dealing with 2015.
We don't have 2015 data. It'd be a good idea if at the end of this year, if we compile that and compare that to the model and see what's changed. But this data is looking at 2010 to 2014.
That the consensus? Is that the consensus numbers?
And these are the peak numbers. Your average day flow varied a little bit year to year. So we look at it conservatively and say what's the largest average day, which would have been 2011. 2.8 MGD is a conservative value. Could be slightly less.
If it's helpful for you, the town secretary today sent me a number. The current population is 12,888.
Yeah, you told me that before. That's the first time I've heard that number. It would be good to know the actual population for today and to get the actual most recent usage numbers. And but the data we've looked at before is based on historical population, historical usage, and we're using that to project forward. So it doesn't exactly line up with 2015. But if I talk about the future, let's talk about that and go into the future and the transition. And really the most important thing is where we end up. At the final build-out of Trophy Club, what will the population be? How many connections will you have? And what's going to be the peak demand?
The only thing that would change is you take the current 1288 or whatever. I mean, it doesn't. Like
yeah,
you said,
it'll change some numbers.
Yeah, the future is what we're looking at. We're not looking at where we are today, except for the
one thing that we really need to know and get a consensus on is the future population 15,000. Is that a good number?
Well,
then
and the thing that caught my attention was there's a statement in there, I think it's maybe on your next chart or so, where we're looking at a 50% increase. Well, that's not the case. I mean, we're sitting
Well,
at
from
12
from
12,
today,
going
if
to
your
15.
population is 12,000 and you're going to 50, obviously you're not 50%. But from the original data, looking at the study period, we are going from that time period to the future. It is a 50% increase.
Gil, can you explain to him the study data that we used? It was from the SCADA system to get these peak demands, peak hours, that sort of thing. We have to look back at the historical data to be able to.
Yeah, it's going to vary year to year because you have dry years and wet years.
Right.
You know, things are going to vary. What you want to do is have a system that can handle the worst case scenario. So if you look back over the last 5 years, you know, your usage, your peak hour varied from, you know, a little bit below around 6 million gallons to 7 million gallons. So your max day, looking forward, you'd want to look at based on past population, you would expect a 7 million gallon maximum day.
Now, are those numbers associated with the date and time that you pull the 9,800 population, or are those numbers associated with the day?
Those numbers are associated with the population.
So it's back in
That's actually
2013?
the peak year from 2010 to 2013 was 2011. And in 2011, you used, it was a 2.8 peak, it's 2.8 average and a 6.8 maximum. I rounded it up to 7.
So again, with I think Jim's saying that population 9,800 isn't tied to those numbers. It's actually tied to 2011 to 2013 or 14. You said, and when it was at least 12,000.
I think what's confusing everyone is this was titled current.
I shouldn't
and
have used the
future,
word current
and
there.
it
Right.
probably should
Yeah.
say
That triggered me.
historical
Yeah.
test period or something.
But those numbers are as of during that time frame that you just mentioned.
Yes.
Okay.
And so I kind of confused the thing by throwing in the word current, so I apologize for that. But what I wanted to say was, looking at the historical data, which had about that population and about those flows, looking from that time period to the future, that's where I got that 50%. Now, where you are today, I don't know exactly where you are today, because you told me the population, so I didn't know that. And exactly what your usage is, I haven't pulled actual data for the last few months to see what your usage has been. But that's why I would say it would be nice if at the end of the year, whatever time period it takes to compile that data, it'd be nice to look at it and verify that back to the model and make sure that it still is in line with what we're predicting for the future. Because really the key, once you, when you plan your system final build out, your final expansions, you know, is 15,000 population correct? And this is a max day of, 10 million gallons a day, is that correct? And if it is, then the recommendations I have now will hold. If that changes, we might need to modify.
I know we have the monthly consumption because that's in your general manager's report later. Is it hard to break that monthly out into daily?
Not for average day, but max day and peak hour, we have to look at the SCADA system to get that.
So talk about gallons per capita per day, that varies a lot also, whether you have a wet year or a dry year. And a 285 is like on the high side for your data. On the lower side, it was about 250, so it could range from 250 to 280 in that range. That connection is 44517. That actually is actual data. I just updated that based on your most recent information. And the elevated storage, the 400,000 refers to your tank that's on the southeast part of town, and the ground storage is the two tanks out here, the 6 million gallons. And just jumping into the future, I don't know about the connections. That was an estimate, the data that we got from you. We could debate that, but it's kind of hard to tell what those final connections will be. But the most important thing is the population and the max day flow. And we're looking at elevated storage based on those numbers. You'll need 900,000 gallons elevated storage. And you'll want 9
Gil, I
million
got a
gallons
question for
ground
you.
storage.
On these numbers, I mean, you're saying, say it's 11,000 in the time frame that you took this other information. The problem with that is, at build out, there's going to be 1407 houses, okay? If you go 2.8 per house, you know, and then we utilize the 500,000 gallon storage tank that's in the pit that was in your connections and stuff. We utilize that. So technically, you know, we don't own it, but we have access to another 500.
It's in the model. When the model
is?
runs, it
Okay.
accounts for that water.
Okay,
The reason I didn't list it here is because for TCEQ requirements, you'll
okay.
need to meet the requirement for TCEQ.
Help me with one thing. This one kind of blew me away too. The difference between, I'm curious to understand how you got the future connections, because it's an increase of 1,886 connections.
Yeah, that number, I didn't come up with that number. That number was given, and I had questions on it still also.
Well, my own rationale was, I was just thinking about it today, and I said, you know, we got 250 apartments in the PID that are coming, and there's probably maybe another maximum of 50 connections in the PID when they build that thing out. There's 25 more connections. That turned out to be true. That's exactly what's on the sheet. 25 more connections to go in the PID. Castleberry Hills in the back has got something less than 150. If they build anything across the street in Solana and whatever little acreage is left, maybe 15 more over there, and commercial here in Trophy Club, maybe 25. So max I could come up with, being super, super conservative, is 515 connections. I'm trying to figure out where in the world did the other 1,351 come from?
Yeah, and I don't have an answer because I had the same question. And I'll walk you through in the model, and I'll talk about that some more as I walk you through some more slides and show you the model.
But I mean,
But the connections aren't, that was an estimate that was, yeah, I don't know, that came from you guys somewhere. I didn't come up with that number.
where did it come from?
But that number's not gonna drive anything.
Okay.
That number's not gonna drive anything. The population is what'll drive it. All the connections will do, will give you a persons per connection to back calculate and use for reference data. But what's important is the population and what you expect your max day flow. The connections is just peripheral, nice to know information, like you could say.
You know, I have to tell you one thing that's probably a big concern. If you were building off of 9,800 people, when it is in actuality almost 13,000, man, we're really close to pushing the limits of these recommendations already, when you get down to it.
And one thing to know about your max day flow, you're not gonna get that in winter. That's gonna be a summer. So it depends on when your population has grown. But this is gonna be a summertime the summertime usage data. So it's not year round.
You mentioned you want us to validate the 15,000.
Yeah,
Did we give you that number, or was that your estimate?
no, that was given, yeah.
That was the number that the town gave us when we were doing the wastewater planning.
And Jim, they've been using that number now for a couple of years as a build-out number.
Just for reference, I pulled some number from the Region C plan a few years ago, 2006. And, you know, per capita water usage is on the high side, usually about 220 or 2, you know, in that range. And just wanted to compare that to typically what you're going to get here is like 250 or a little bit above. So that's why your water system demands might be a little bit more.
Yeah, I want to add in, I went back and looked at our water conservation plan, because right now our per capita per day is at 285, and the plan that we adopted, our water conservation plan, our goal was to get that down to 201 gallons per capita per day by 2018, and by 2023 down to 190. We have not seen that reducing, we've seen that increasing.
On this map, the areas that I highlighted in yellow were the areas where I was adding future. I was just counting lots and using the same, you know, usage per connection as you currently have. And that's kind of the same thing Jim, you were talking about. You were adding up all the additional connections. And what I did was I added up down here in the south, that's the PD 30, and then the other two up here, that's where there's some, you know, more development going on. And I ended up, it was like 500 or 600 additional connections, similar to what you had. And so the rest of it, I didn't know where that additional demand would be. So what I did with that demand, I spread it evenly across the city. So what that in effect does, that increased in the future model to get to that maximum flow, basically your people per household went up a little bit, a fraction, to make that spread out evenly across the city.
But I understand what you've done, but we're almost completely built out, and there's just no way there's 1,300 empty lots spread throughout the town. It just doesn't exist.
Well, based on the aerials where I counted up a similar number that you did. So that 50% growth was from historical data to the future. You know, as showed in the picture before, there's limited areas where there's going to be single-family home development, and so really the persons per connection has to increase above what it is now in order to meet that future demand is kind of my point. So right now, if you're getting about, how much is, I think you're getting, well, based on your real population, I'll have to recalculate it. I don't know what it's going to be, but you know, somewhere around 2.3 or 2.4 persons per connection. It may actually end up being 2.5, 2.6 in order to get to that ultimate 15,000 population. Because where are those 15,000 people going to go? You know, one thing that's going to be different is the PD30. That's going to be kind of a high-density multifamily type environment. And typically when you put something like that in, they're going to have a lot less water usage per capita. But right now we're counting those the same as anybody else in a house. So in reality, whatever that factor is, we could be overestimating a little bit there. But to be conservative, you don't want to be short. We just counted the multifamily the same as the regular households.
So an apartment dweller is traditionally less.
Yeah, I mean, they're not going to be watering lawns, and typically they'll just use a little bit less water. But we counted them the same as if they were any other house. Okay, so the 15,000 population, if we extrapolate from where we were to where we're going, we would go to a 4.28 MGD average day and a 10.8 maximum day and a 24.5 peak hour. So what you want to base your system on is that peak hour. You want to be able to supply that peak hour and still have the reservoir and your elevated tanks to do fire flow. Looking at the supply side, the current supply from Fort Worth, what you're allocated is 3.7, but I realize you're taking more than that. You're taking at least 5 or so average. The additional future supply in the plan is a 6.6 additional, which will get you to a 10.3. So that's what Fort Worth has allocated to provide this Trophy Club. It's a 10.3, which is in line with the, you know, we're a little bit higher on our maximum day at 10.8, but at 10.3 is a good number. So that's where we are on the supply. And that supply will come, I guess you're probably all aware of the plan in place that will upgrade a line from Kaler Tank to Westlake. I think that's a 36-inch line. And they're slotting 6.6 MGD within that tank, within that line to be for Trophy Club. And it's got some more flow in it that goes to Westlake and also for Fort Worth, but your portion of that is a 6.6 MGD. So that will get your allocation up to that 10.3.
Gil, I want to interject that just so that they know this, but I just want to point out that that is actually broken into 2 projects, the Kaler tank to where it ends, and then we'll be discussing later the next phase, which is from where that ends up to Westlake. Then a third phase that might come in the future is from basically Westlake's meter there on 170 up to our water plant. That would be on our own. That is not Fort Worth's line, and there's no other entities that pull off of that line. So this 36-inch line will eventually go all the way from Kaler Tank to Westlake if we want to participate in that. But we only have agreed to participate in that first phase from Kaler Tank. And that's what, if you recall, their last estimate was about $800,000 will be our share of that. We have that set aside.
Jennifer, later in the presentation, there's a Friesen Nichols report, which is recommending option B, which is the 24-inch line. Is that the one we're actually talking about? There was an option A, B, and C to approach this line, and option B was what Friesen Nichols was recommending, which is
It was a 30-inch that they're recommending, but yes, it was option B and a 30-inch, I believe. When we get to that one, I can look better.
Okay. I think I made a note on,
But the Kaler tank apparently is over on the west side of Westlake instead of at their vault, which is along 114. So is that new expanded line, whether it be 30 inches or whatever, it's not going to run all the way to their vault?
No, the first phase is not.
it was there.
But what we'll be talking about tonight is the second phase, which is a project with just Fort Worth, Westlake, and the district. And it goes from where that Kaler tank first phase line ends up to Westlake's vault.
And Jennifer, you were right. I found my note. It is 30 inch.
So let me get a feel for where Kaler tank is. Is it along 170? Do you folks know, or maybe we know?
Do you have a map of that? on this?
377 and 170. Is it close to that?
I think I have that study, Jim.
That's west of 377?
Yeah.
I didn't know, okay.
This is an old map, so I think, but the west, the Gaylord tank is up here. Here's Westlake here,
Mm-hmm.
and the Cater tank is up in here.
Where's 377?
Here's 370, here's 170, here's 377, there's the Westlake.
Oh,
It is way over.
Okay.
See if I can blow this up and y'all can see
I
it.
never saw it. I know. I thought it was that group that was.
I guess the next piece of that is from Westlake to Trophy Club. You have the existing 21-inch line, which you currently use. There's no backup for that. And if you only had that in the future, then you would try to get that 10.3 MGD through that 21-inch pipe, which would take a 6.6 feet per second velocity, which may or may not work. It probably wouldn't be reliable. We'd have to find out exactly what the city has behind that, what kind of head they have behind to see if they could push that. They probably couldn't. So it would be tough to rely on that 21-inch line for your peak future flow. Some proven alternatives that we were looking at for that is to lay a parallel 24-inch line or lay a parallel 30-inch line. A 24-inch line would handle the 6.6 MGD that they're adding additional at acceptable velocity. If you went with a 30-inch line, you could handle the entire 10.3 MGD and not rely on that 21-inch line at all, so you'd have redundancy. So really, for redundancy's sake, we were considering that the better choice may be the 30-inch line for the additional cost. You would have a line that by itself, the 30-inch line would be all you would need. You would have the 21-inch line there as a parallel backup.
Can you all
Yep.
tell me what year that 21-inch line went in? Does anyone know that?
Long time ago.
I'm saying like around 2004 or 5,
It was way back.
2004?
or early 2000, wasn't it?
It's when they put in 170.
Come on, Mike.
It was very close to, in conjunction
I
with
would have
170.
had to, because I saw where it was sold in the 80s.
What?
Jim, if you,
I think, Kevin, I think it was around 1995.
Okay.
Or maybe the 90s. Let me see something. It's with the packet.
Jim Hayes, I don't know if you have the online packet, but page 70 will show you that route of the water line. It's got a pictorial of it.
Okay.
We'll get to it.
1989 was when it looks like you all sold it to Fort Worth.
Yeah, it was there before that, obviously.
Time flies.
That might have been the FDIC I was thinking of when we settled that thing.
Well, that was, yeah, the early 2000s.
Yes. That's what I was.
2004, you're about right. The old Gibraltar savings.
Yep.
You know, notice how, Gil, we kind of move around.
Well, that's
all over
fine,
the place.
yeah.
Whatever happened to that line that was come down through South Lake, bend to the northwest toward Westlake, and join with that 21-inch line. Wasn't that a plan at one time to do that? So they would have a circular,
Loop.
I was told by Wendy with Fort Worth at one time that yes, that was something that I guess at some time everyone was looking at, and they never could bring all the different entities together to agree to exactly how the route would go and everything, and they just kind of gave up on it at some point. Now South Lake has put a line in that my understanding is in a similar route, but it belongs to South Lake. It's not a regional line, but it does come up like towards our tank even, doesn't it? Yeah, towards our elevated, but it is South Lake's line. It's not part of the regional project or regional.
Do you know the, sorry, Jim, go ahead. I was just gonna ask, do you know the size of the South Lakes line?
30-inch. I think actually when we were designing the plant, I'm sorry, the water line relocation over there in Westlake, there was a point where it had to cross their 30-inch line, and so I remember seeing that on the plans that it was a 30-inch.
do they have a circular feed over at South Lake? Dillers, do they have one that goes from Fort Worth out to South Lake and turns around and goes back? So if he breaks on one leg, you still have the other. Do they have that ability in South Lake? Does anybody know? Because that was the original plan for Trophy Club. We wanted to have it come around in a circle so if one leg got down somehow, we still have water coming.
Well,
in.
if theirs comes up basically on 170, crosses in front of us and goes into South Lake, their other feeder at one time was coming north
That's right.
from Bedford. So now they do have a
It
circular.
probably is.
Yeah, I didn't think they would go without a circular
Okay.
feed.
But again, that was a discussion back in about 2007, when Fort Worth was kind of driving it to make one continuous loop, so they would have a way of pushing water if there was ever a real break in the line on one side or the other. So, but again, it died off because, mostly because of money. It was going to be too expensive for Fort Worth to do it. So,
Okay.
Right, Gil.
Talk about elevated storage now. I'll keep moving on. The elevated storage, you need it, of course, to maintain system pressure and to provide fire flows. And the target is you want to maintain at least 30% full even during your peak hour demand. So that's what we try to build it to do.
Gil, is that a TCEQ target or?
The 33% full? I don't think, I don't know if TCEQ gets specific on that. I'm not sure if that's a TCEQ requirement, but it's a typical design requirement. I mean, it's a typical
Is that
design.
an industry standard, or where does the 33 come from? I guess what I'm asking.
Industry standard. If it's more than that, I'm not aware of a regulation that requires that. But in practical sense, if you want to be able to fight a fire during a peak flow event, you have to have at least that. That's why that's there, to give you that reserve to fight the fire. Some places keep it above 33%, but 33% is kind of a minimum. What the TCEQ requirement is, though, for elevated storage is what's next on there, and that's they require 100 gallon per connection. So just looking at that number now with the current connections, if you break it out between the mud and the PID, the mud has 3149 connections, so you require 314,000 gallons currently. And you have 400,000 gallons that you can book based on your southeast tank. The PID has 1368 connections, so they need at least 136,800 gallons. They have 500,000 gallons that they can book against that.
But if that 638,300 gallons is overstated, if the connections are.
That's true. Yeah, if the connections really aren't going to be that number, then that is overstated. That's true.
And I think we said we couldn't imagine how we get up to 6383.
Right. So if we could get to a valid number we could come to consensus with on that we could use, that would help us fine tune. But the main thing we need to look at is, you have 400,000 gallons available for the mud. And you're okay for now, but as you grow, you're not gonna be okay. Even, you don't have to get to the 6,000 connections before you have a problem. You just need to get, to the 400,000 gallon limit. And so, you need another tank. You don't need it today, but you're gonna need it pretty soon.
Well, we could accommodate 4,000 connections with a 400,000 gallon tank,
For TCEQ requirements.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But for, to have fire flow, that's,
At 33% can't be maintained with a 400,000.
Well, gets kind of convoluted because you do have the 500,000 gallon tank in your system, even though you can't count it for your connections. You do have the water, and it does feed the system. So,
Did you calculate any properties across the street in these numbers? Because,
across
I mean,
the
this
street.
is
Solana.
in
Solana,
Solana area.
Westlake.
Yeah, part of the system is in Solana.
Okay,
yes.
because again, you say current 4173, well, you gotta take about 14 or 1385 or 1390 off that, because that's the district, the PID,
Well, he did break it
Yeah,
down.
in the
and
sub-bullet, look at the
mud.
smaller print.
okay.
The
And
mud
yeah,
is
1368,
Yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
And in the future, it includes both, right? 6383?
Yes.
Yeah, so the 6383 is a debatable number, but the other two numbers are actual today. The 3149 for the mud and the 1368 for the PID, those are current. And so you have 400,000 gallons available in your southeast tank, so you do have more than the TCEQ requirement for your connections.
Let me ask Jennifer a question. Back in the days when we were building the 500,000 gallon tank over by the high school, it was the Murdad who was representing the PID asked for a 300,000 gallon tank, and he was going to pay for it. Then we asked the tank to be increased to 500,000, and but he came to us and said, if you will reduce my $4 million payment for old infrastructure that the PID would have access to, I will pay for the entire 500,000 gallon tank, and you take 200,000 off my $4 million. I thought, Jennifer, that we had a claim on some of that 500,000 gallon tank. From a water point of view, certainly we did from a pressure point of view. But do you think we do not have a claim on that last 200 of the 500 gallon tank?
Well, if you recall, last month we talked about this, and the town said that we could submit to them an allocation agreement for their consideration, and that they did not see it that way, that we had any capacity allocation in that tank. So you all voted not to submit a capacity allocation request to them. So I think the answer is no, we don't have any capacity in that tank.
Well,
It does help float our system, but we don't have capacity. We have to have an agreement to show TCQ we have a certain amount of capacity in that if we want to claim capacity in that.
And Jennifer, I think, weren't they kind of indicating that we only had like a 36,000 gallon portion, and it was a significantly small number.
Yeah, there was an email, and it seemed like to me it was like 70,000 gallons or something that they calculated out.
Smaller.
It was very small.
Yeah.
Jennifer, if I recall correctly, there are 10 entry points between our system and the PID system throughout the lands, 10 places where water can flow back and forth.
I thought it was 7 or 8.
8,
It's
I
8.
believe.
8, all right. I mean, unless, unless you put meters on those things, I mean, it's really one big water system. I mean, we own a piece of the infrastructure, they own a piece of the infrastructure, but the water flows wherever the water needs to flow.
Well, we understand that, and in the model, Gil did use that tank as part of our part of the system as a whole, floating it. But there's kind of a difference of TCEQ requirements versus how our system operates, and so your you are correct that it is considered in this model to kind of look at the way the pressure is, and as he showed, it actually kind of, our system's kind of divided in a east and a west side, even though they're intertwined. The elevated on the west side kind of floats the west side of town, and the one on the east side floats the east side. But for TCEQ requirements and for design of our system, unless we have an allocation in that tank, we can't count it as part of our system.
Then I appreciate where we're headed, but before we can make any substantial decisions, these numbers have got to be corrected to be more accurate and aligned with what's real. I mean, if you're using 100 gallons for every single connection, and you're using 6,383 connections, which could be over 1,300 inflated, we need to come with a better number so we can figure out what the TCEQ requirement really is.
But to see the TCU requirement would be for mud connections. You'd take out all the pit connections. So basically, you know, the tank actually has 440,000 gallon elevated capacity. So you could say we have 400, if you do the 100 gallons, that's, you know, we're talking, you know, we're not there yet. So, but, you know, I agree with you that some of these numbers need to be updated, and maybe because of 2015, we can update them. Because bottom line, we need look at our needs and then plan for the future.
Yeah.
And go from there.
And Neil, if my number's even semi-accurate, if you yank the 25 in there out of the PID, which I had in there, that leaves 485. Well, you had 485 to 3149, and we're under our 400,000 gallon tank has got us covered.
Okay, but
We
then,
don't exceed it.
well, but there's other issues with that tank and the lines that connect to it that we need to talk
I'm
about.
just addressing Jennifer's point about TCEQ requirement.
I agree.
Well, I'm going to go back and look at the minutes of the meeting we had with Murdad, because I remember the meeting was on a Sunday afternoon.
It was
Mur-
sunny out. I remember that too.
You didn't go to church that day either. Anyway, I think there is some record of Murdad saying, reduce my $4 million liability, and I'll take over your part of the 500,000 gallon tank. Because it was only going to be 300. We asked as a mud board to have it go 500. And we said we would pay the difference. He then came back and said, I'll pay the whole thing if you knock 200.
It's in the minutes because I've read them a number of times. And I think it's like October 2006 or even might be 5, but it was agreed upon. But again, there was no contract between the town and the Mud 1 or Master District at that time
Right.
that actually stated that we would have, you know, capacity in that.
Jim, you negotiated that. If I recall, the town was not involved. That was yourself and Dean and maybe Kevin and Murdad.
No, it was in a Master District meeting that we.
Yeah, but I mean, the town wasn't even present
No, Nick was there.
in that negotiation.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I did come to a meeting late on where Nick was there. You're
Yeah,
right.
he was there.
You're right.
We never did reduce it to a contract simply because at that point in time, the 500,000 gallon tank, it was agreed with Murdad and with the town that we would put that the same height as the 400 gallon tank, and we would have constant pressure
Right.
from both tanks. At that point in time, we weren't too concerned about the number of gallons up there and who owned them. We were more concerned about the pressure.
Pressure.
And but you know, I think the intention was that it went from 300 to 500 because Mud asked for it to be expanded.
It was October 2006.
So that's what I'm getting at is that between the two tanks and the number of connections throughout the town, PID and non-PID, the two tanks are probably more than sufficient to provide the 100 gallons per meter.
Yes, they are.
And I don't see why we would want to spend a bunch of money to build a third tank if those two put together All right, now I realize that we're not as congenial as we used to be in the old days. So what's mud's mud, what's town's town. But this is one instance where I think we ought to look at both tanks together and the total requirement of 100 gallons per meter and see if they aren't sufficient. They seem to me like they would be sufficient.
Then in terms of TCEQ requirement, if you can count the PIDS tank as part of the mud, you're covered. If you can't, as soon as you reach 4,000 connections, if you reach 4,000 connections, you have to have another tank.
Well, I think we need to have a conversation with the town.
Yeah,
So there are options there, but having the tank, a tank, to cover the requirements would be a top priority. So whichever way it works out.
and just for the record, it was Sunday, you were right on that day, at 1 o'clock, October 22nd, 2006, and actually, Director Borges, Carroll, made the motion that he would pay 3.8 and then also pay the part of the wastewater, the elevated tank, to supply the mud district and stuff in the PID. So if you want to go back and check those minutes.
Okay. Jim, I remember fairly, I think accurately, that, when Dean brought that idea forward, there was some thought that we needed that to make sure we could get fire suppression to Solana. At the time, it was a MUD 1 issue. The MUD 1 and MUD 2 still were separate entities, and MUD 2 agreed and said, yeah, let's go for it.
Yeah, I don't recall that we thought
No.
that there
Okay,
was a
we're
problem.
off, a little bit off topic, but back then was toward the west end of the existing MUD 2. The 500,000 gallon tank with the extra 200,000 that we negotiated would help with pressure on that side. Because at the same time, while the PID was starting and going, Robert Scott added a new high-speed variable pump into the system to help maintain the pressure. And we were doing that as a stopgap measure until such time as the elevated tank was finished. Because we were then, for the next couple of years, after the town manager, to start on the bid out the contract for the tank, get it built, and so forth. In fact, you and I had meetings where we met with elevated tank people down in Austin, and just getting an idea of the cost and the different types of elevated tanks. It could be concrete, steel, all this other stuff. But the whole point was it wasn't for Solana because it's too far away. The whole point was to maintain the proper pressure and everything for the west end of MUD 2.
I guess really the bottom line is with the 8 connections, the towers being built same height. The idea was to provide pressurization throughout the PID, throughout the mud, whatever that eventually became. Now, obviously, we've got to make our 100 gallons per TCEQ requirement, but if my numbers are right, we'll make that easy. And if you add the 2 tanks together for fire suppression, it looks like we got plenty of water for fire suppression.
Yeah, the 2 tanks are plenty.
'Cause
And in the
PID's
model,
nowhere near.
they I'll show you some results in the model. We do have to make some adjustments to make that southeast tank fully functional, but I'll show you that in a few slides. But if you were having to add a 3rd tank, this is the location that we had found that
I
would be a
would
possibility.
quarrel with this sentence at the previous chart. It says addition of a 500,000 gallon elevated tank is a priority. I'm not convinced of that yet.
If, if you can count what's in the PID, then you don't have a problem.
Right.
If you can't, then there's a problem.
Sure we can.
Well, depends on connections too.
Well, even if you don't count them, Gil,
Well, the water's there, you can fight fire with it.
if you add
so.
all the rest of the connections to us, which is about 500, we're still underneath the number it takes per 100 with our tank. And so really and truthfully, what you have to be concerned about is fire suppression. The 2 tanks together have got that covered.
So we need to pin down an accurate number for future connections
Yes.
to make this resolved, I think. for ground storage. You have the 6 million gallons currently, which is close to your max day now. For the future, we're proposing in one more 3 million gallon tank, so you would have 9 million gallons, which would be close to your future max day.
Where did you locate that third tank?
The only place we know it can fit is down here at the end of the street, beside the other two.
Well, is,
Yeah, we didn't draw up plans for that or anything, but that's the location that we understood.
It'd be the same size as the two tanks out there.
It'd be the same size. So it would take up pretty much where that building is, and then a big part of that parking area down there.
Kevin, I'm not trying to beat on you personally, but I was disappointed because in two specific meetings 5-6 months ago, back to back, I asked you that when you presented this thing to please show us a footprint of where you'd put that tank. I was disappointed, but it wasn't included.
that
We
was-
haven't, this is just the study, this is just the modeling. We haven't finished the complete study. There's still some reports and things we gotta do, and that's where that location of that pipe, of that tank would be included in that. On the modeling, we're just modeling to say, yes, we need it. As far as the location, that type of thing, we know about where it's at. But what you're talking about will come in the next phase of the study, which is included in our phase. We just hadn't got there yet.
Would it be fair to say, because of the Elevation and Trophy Club, we don't have a whole lot of choices? The tank goes back here where the police department sits, so we don't build it.
Well, it makes sense
I
to
mean-
be there
I mean,
because
you
that's
can't-
where
you
your
can't
booster
jack the thing up
station.
70-something
you
feet on the
talking-
backside to make the elevations
You
the same.
talking elevated and storage?
Yeah.
What are we, you're talking storage,
I'm
he's
talking
talking
storage.
elevated.
I'm talking storage.
We're talking ground storage
Okay.
now, ground
You're talking
storage,
ground storage.
not
Okay.
the elevated.
The ground storage, it makes sense to be back here because that's where your pumps are. If not, then you're gonna have to have another booster station, and some other things else. It makes sense to come at all in one location, have all your storage together to a certain extent, and then your booster pumps together to pump out to distribution.
And
That
when-
makes sense.
And when we were looking at upgrading the two tanks from 2 to 3 million, one of the things that we did was a fairly extensive study of, could we put a third tank someplace else? We even looked very hard about putting it down with the elevated tank at Byron Nelson, because there was enough land that if they put that tank off to the side, there'd be enough room for another tank. It doesn't work elevation-wise. I mean, you'd have to build it up too high.
Are we talking elevating or ground storage?
It's
The
talking,
elevation of the 3 storage tanks, Kevin, have got to
Okay,
be
you
the same, or
talking
they don't flow-
storage.
They don't flow in conjunction with each other.
You just mentioned elevated by Byron Nelson, you meant storage.
Elevation within the storage tank.
Yeah, in the
They have
base
to-
of it.
They've got to be at the same height to flow together,
You keep-
otherwise the flow doesn't work.
We discounted that at the time and decided it had to be out here, okay?
Right, that's my point.
It makes sense to put it out here.
Sure, well, that's,
As far as when you would need that ground storage tank, it's not an immediate need. It would be probably one of the longer-term things out of all of these in the study. You will need it eventually as your peak flow actually gets up to the 10 million.
Kevin, please, let me ask one more time, just so it doesn't get lost. When we talked about the third tank going out here, you know, we said it's got to sit on top of where the police station sits, and they've got to get moved before we can do that. But if you recall, a lot of the concern was, how close can we put that tank to the cemetery's fence and still be able to do the right maintenance between it and the cemetery fence? How much room do we have to have in front of it to secure it and maintain a proper fire lane inside the property? We talked about, can you move it to the left back there, or can you move it some to the right? The whole reason was trying to maximize parking spaces so that if this annex building ever got used for something else, we would know how many cars could get back there. Just don't want anybody to forget that.
Next, I'll get into the distribution system improvements. This is just another view of the system where it shows the thickness of the lines is kind of proportional to the diameter of the pipe, give you a feel for what size diameters are out there.
Is all this on the north side of 114, this picture you got up there?
Yeah,
now?
114 would run right through here.
Okay.
The southern part is the Solana.
But
So
this
this,
heavy blue line going out to the west,
that heavy blue line is that 21-inch line coming in from Fort Worth.
okay.
where it has that right angle, Jim, is where it goes underneath
Goes under
114.
114.
Okay.
Then runs along
thought-
711, then comes up Trophy Club
Right.
Drive.
Right.
What we're now saying, based on your study, that 21-inch line's not going to be sufficient.
Yeah, to get your 10.3 allocation from Fort Worth, you'd want a larger line or a parallel line. So aside from the feed within the distribution system itself, I kind of broke these into east and west systems. They do operate pretty much independently to a large extent. On the eastern side, what I've highlighted in red is today, you have trouble today operating that tank efficiently because during a peak demand, you can't fill it. There's too much resistance in those pipes. The pipes are too small. All the flow wants to go to the west side because there's less resistance there. The water is going to follow the path of least resistance, and the least resistance is to the west.
Gil, from the main line coming down, is that blue piece of pipe a different size than the red? Or are they the same size, it just doesn't flow?
Okay, if you're talking right here, wherever the hand is,
right.
that's 14-inch currently.
And the red is what?
And the red is a mixture of 10s and 8s and some 12s.
Okay.
But what I've highlighted them for red to indicate that today those should be bigger than they are in order to operate that tank efficiently. But if you're going to fix it, you need to fix it for the future. And this slide shows what it needs to be fixed for the future.
Is that blue square up in left side of your picture, is that the vault?
Up here?
Yeah.
Yes, that is the pump stations and the tanks and the vault, yeah. Let me go back one. Yeah, so that's right here. That's kind of what divides the east and the west.
Right.
Coming out of the pump station, one way is the west side, one way is the east side. And they really only connect again back up at the north when you cross the golf course up there in the northern part. So this is what's today with your current demands. This red is what's inadequate for what you're doing today. But for the future, this is what's inadequate for what's going to happen in the future. So what I've highlighted.
When you think in terms of right-of-way, and obviously you can't tear one pipe out while you're trying to put another one in. You got to keep.
You got to maintain service.
Well,
Yeah.
It's hard for me to tell. Looking at the red, is it similar within the existing right-of-way? Or are you proposing a different right-of-way to get to the tank? It looks to me like it curves down.
Well, I really didn't get into the design. How are you going to physically go out there and do a plan to change this pipe? But this is more of a hydraulic model.
Okay.
What needs to be there hydraulically to make the system work?
Okay.
So in terms of that, in terms of hydraulics, the 14-inch, the 10-inch, and the 8-inch pipes that go out to that southeastern tank are inadequate. They need to be 24 and 21-inch for your future flow. And so, how you get them in is another question. But just for the hydraulic study, this is the size we need to get there. But you're right, you do need to maintain service while you're changing them out, so there are some challenges to that, and that'd be the next step. But just to let you know what needs to be out there in the system is basically from the pump station to wherever you're going to connect to PT30, that needs to be a 24-inch pipe. And currently it's a 14. From that point on, which would be somewhere in this area where the mouse is, right in here. From that point on, all the way to the elevated tank, you're going to need 21-inch pipe. And what that is now, I've kind of highlighted this 14-inch in this area needs to go to 21. When you get down in this area, it's 10-inch. When you get down in here, you got some 8-inch. And then you got 10-inch again. And then around this loop, around the thing, you got 12-inch. So all of this that I highlighted red needs to become 21-inch. So and that's probably the single most important improvement to this system to make your existing tank work like it should and to get that east side operating as it should. The west side's in pretty good shape. It's the pipes there are pretty well sized. The elevated tank, which is the PIDS, it works good. It's adequate. It does a good job. But this, what I've highlighted in red, is the existing system's weak point. So that's the biggest change on the system. This is just a hydraulic grade line. If you look from the pump station to the elevated tank, the brown is the land, is the ground surface, and the blue is the hydraulic grade line. And today, with today's system, if you tried to get the future peak flow, this is what the hydraulic grade line would look like. And you can see if the blue ever touched the green or the brown, you'd basically have zero pressure or you go vacuum, and it gets pretty close. When you change that line to 24-inch initially and then 21-inch to the tank, then you get over here on the right a hydraulic grade line which maintains pressures, you know, from 40 to 60 even at the peak hour flow. So that's what the model showed the difference would be when you changed out that pipe. And if you want to go beyond that, what I've highlighted in yellow are some other areas that if we do hit that peak flow as we're anticipating, these would be areas that might need a little upgrade also. And probably the one over here on the right is the most important. This is, I think, the higher elevation, and they have the lower pressures. So they're going to have the lowest pressures of this area right here, and those would need to be upgraded in those sections too. Those would be a lower priority, wouldn't be an immediate need, but would be something you'd want to do as your system, you know, would finally reach the future build out population.
Are those properties kind of up by the three-way stop up there? Probably one of the highest spots in Trophy Club.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we've had pressure up there for a long time, pressure problems.
Yeah, and you still, yeah, even with upgrading this line to the 21-inch, you're still going to have a little bit of problem up there. So that's why those ones I highlighted in yellow would need to be upgraded also to help out that pressure issue. Over on the west side, no immediate needs on the system, but future needs. I think you only have a 12-inch line going to the tank up here in the north, and that isn't quite adequate when you get to the future flows. It needs to be bigger. And just a few other spots that I picked out there were places where there was just too much head loss or too much resistance in the pipe. Those would need to be upgraded if possible. They would be a lower priority than all the other things, though. And when we do the final report, we'll, you know, detail these out, exactly where they are and what type of upgrade they would need. This is just an illustration of using the current pipe sizes that you've got in the system, but your future demands. And any place that's red is places where the pressure would go below 30 psi. In some places it gets almost down to 0. But as you can see, the entire eastern side, the pressures all go below 30. The west side, surprisingly, even at future flows, you really don't get pressures down that low. It still works pretty well.
Gil, help me here.
Mhm.
My house is on the east side,
Okay.
and it's kind of back up towards the top of what you got. I have 58 PSI at my house.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've measured it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not under 30.
This is future. This is if we did not upgrade the pipes
Oh,
and we got to the future flow.
Okay,
This is what would happen.
I got you.
And this wouldn't be all the time. This would be at the peak hour demand.
okay.
And then even with the upgrades that I talked about, this area here is still getting low pressures. So that's where those yellow highlights I had would probably need to be put in place to alleviate those low pressures, even with the new 21-inch line going in. The next couple of graphs just kind of illustrate what the model shows, what happens in your elevated tanks. So the red line is the southeast tank, and the green line is the north tank. And if you use the existing pipes, but went ahead and went to your future flows, this is what would happen. The red tank would empty and stay empty for an hour during your peak event, and the northern tank would only get down to 40%. It would still stay 40% full. That's if you had all your pumps running full out, trying to get all the water you could to the system, and when your peak hour happens, you would still drain that tank. Once you upgrade that line that we looked at, then it's a lot better. Your red tank wouldn't get below 50% in this scenario, and the northern tank would still be right about 40%. So that line upgrade is what will make your tank work much more efficient. And this is at future flows, so this is what it would look like with that.
Now, you mean the line up Indian Creek to the tank?
Yes, that big, the 24 and then 21-inch line,
Yeah,
all the way tank, it makes this improvement. As far as the pumps go, right now you have 2 pumps that are a higher capacity, like, I can't remember the 4,000 gallon per minute. It's your typical flow, upper flows. And then you have 3 smaller pumps, older, that are constant speed instead of variable. That blue line across here is actually, that's 3 pumps. There are 3 lines on top of each other. Those are your 3 constant speed pumps, the smaller ones. So they're all 3 running. And then the green line and the red line are your 2 larger VFD pumps. So you can see whenever you have all 5 pumps running, that's what it took to make the system run. And the problem with that is you can't run all 5 pumps. That means you have no redundancy. You have to have a redundant pump. So you've got to be able to maintain, you've got to be able to meet your peak hour demand with 4 pumps and still have a 5th pump as a standby. So what that means is those 3 constant speed pumps will need to be upgraded over time. Doesn't have to be all at one time. As your demands increase, you'll need to start upgrading those pumps. So eventually you'll have 5 pumps that would be equivalent to the 2 larger pumps you have now.
Gil, they're a lot more expensive. Should we think in terms of variable speeds when we upgrade?
Variable speeds are more flexible. You have a lot more operational flexibility. You could get by with a couple of them that were constant speed. You just turn them on when you've got higher demands. Kind of be an operational decision. So your current peak hour demand is 11,000 gallons per minute, and we're looking at a future peak hour demand of 17,000 gallons per minute. So just kind of recapping the pumps, you need 4 pumps that can meet that 17,000 gallons per minute, so they'd be about 4,250 each. And you need 1 redundant. So you've got 2 pumps that can do that. You need 3 more that'll do that, and you just upgrade those over time as the demands increase. So to sum it up in the priorities, kind of see getting the water supply from Fort Worth, getting the decision on that. That's probably #1 priority. If you can't get the water here, then you don't have the water. But internally to your system, the most important thing is that that line from the pump station to the southeast tank. So I'd say that's your 2nd priority. And the elevated storage may or may not be a requirement. It is important, but as long as you can meet the need, whichever way you do it would work. Improving the high service pumps, can be done over time. You just match the pace of your development. Increased ground storage is not an immediate need. It will be a need in the future. It's probably several years out, but you just match that to your growth and your demand. And what would be important is to make sure you just have the place to put it available. And then those other minor choke points in the system, those wouldn't be a high priority. Those would just be after you've done the other things. And if some of them you may never do, some of them might be more important. And the way I did the model was I spread out demands evenly, across the system. It may not actually be that way. So in the future, you might find one part of town has a little bit more demand than you anticipated, one part has less, so things might shift a little bit. So some of those yellow highlights may not be needed after all. It just depends on, how the future goes. So it'd be something you'd want to revisit in the future. But typically over on the west side, you don't have many problems. Over on the east side, it's kind of obvious. You got that main line and then that one high point that had the low
I
pressure.
had a question. We have time. This #1 priority, estimated cost of Trophy Club of $12 to $14 million. Does that 800,000 line that we talked about part of this, Jennifer, or is that?
No, the 800,000 line that we are participating in, that's from Kaler Tank.
Right,
Then where it says here 4.4 million,
right.
excuse me, that's the project that we'll talk about next on the agenda, from where the Kaler Tank project ends to the vault at Westlake.
Okay.
The 12 to 14 million is from Westlakes to Trophy Club out here out front. That is the project on our own. That's not a part of the regional project.
Okay, thank you.
So from a hydraulic perspective, those are the issues. And any other questions? Or we will be following up this. You'll get a full report. We'll do a report in more detail on this, so you'll get that in the future. And there's more work to be done, as Kevin said, about the other pieces.
What's your time frame for getting the final report? Any ballpark?
It would probably Probably be done like in late December, probably get it to you in January.
Okay.
Any other questions? If
We
not,
appreciate it. This is eye-opening.
thank you. Yeah, it is. That $14 million is a real eye-opener.
In the meantime, we're gonna
That does have contingency
get
built
more
into it.
accurate numbers.
Yeah.
We're gonna get firmer numbers to put in the report. We're gonna get better numbers or more accurate numbers.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can, this was, we met with Jennifer and put this, and she wanted to put some numbers, so we basically used what numbers had come from some of the other reports that Fort Worth had done, and then tried to interpret them and put them into where, apply them to what we were doing. So we can do some more as we get into a little bit more detail to come up with some better numbers to come forward on that.
Okay.
Those numbers have contingency built into it and also some assumptions, unknowns about right
And
away.
Keith, we're close enough to build out. We can probably come up with a pretty darn accurate number for connections.
I think
Good.
right now the regional water plan says that we end up with 6,400 connections. I think we looked at that. That was done in, I guess, 2011 by the previous manager. That's where he saw it going.
The connections will affect the elevated storage,
Oh, yeah.
but the other won't.
Oh, yeah,
The
I understand.
15,000 population, is that a reasonable plan? We started out at 14,000, if you remember right, and then all of a sudden it was jumped to 15, so that's what we've been using our plateau. If that's not an accurate number, then we need to back off of that, but that's what we've been working with all along.
Probably a
And
good
then
number.
the 10 million gallons is something we sort of worked back in, worked it plus based on Mike's experience and everything, that that 10 million gallons is probably the peak demand of what we need to shoot for. So we feel like those two numbers are very close and accurate, and so the model works for that. The other numbers on getting there, we can adjust those to make things in, because there's a lot of different parameters and things you need to look that can adjust to make that work. But I don't think it's going to affect the long-term end result a whole lot.
It looks pretty obvious that bigger line is gonna be necessary. It looks pretty obvious that we've gotta fix this line going to the tank. The other elevated additional storage, I'm not sure that's gonna be required.
Well, it all depends if you can use that tank or not.
I'm not talking about the math. The math's good as it is, and with the 8 entry points back and forth, you use that tank. Unless they put meters in and shut them off.
I think you're right, Keith. It all depends on what the final agreement with the town is concerning the 500,000 gallon tank.
If y'all can make that work, then I don't think the elevated tank goes away.
Well, you saw the model works with those two tanks as they
Yes.
are today.
Right.
Well, this question's not for you two fellows, but this is for Jennifer. At one time, I thought we owned the 21-inch pipe all the way from our vault up to 377. And at one time, Fort Worth wanted to buy that from us. Apparently, that must have fallen through. They no longer want to buy it, I guess. Have you ever heard anything about that? Is that new to you?
Yes, that's new to me. I didn't know that they did want to
that-
buy it.
Back in, now almost 10 years ago, Fort Worth had a proposal where they would buy the 21-inch line, and we were open to it.
Yes.
And what happened was because of other infrastructure costs, they just never went forward with it. So that was, it was Fort Worth basically to come back to us. And so about 2008 or 2009, it just was dropped.
Okay.
Okay, Mr. Rose, you wish to speak to us? I think we know it, but give your name and address.
Bill Rose, 219 Inverness. First of all, I want to thank everyone for the discussion and the presentation tonight. I too share some of the concerns that were expressed. When I reviewed the presentation in the packet, the numbers caught my attention. The 50% growth factor jumped right off the page at me. And so I too think that as we approach build out here and what we know about what's on the books and a fair look at what's coming downstream, you could probably be a lot more granular, more detailed in determining what your actual needs are. I looked at estimates of population. I didn't ask the town secretary. I have absolutely no idea where she got that number from. My source when I need population data is I go to North Central Texas Council of Governments. They have a data research center, and they track buildings that are going on in a community and apply population densities to those buildings. And I'll just quickly run through this. The 2010 census on April 1st had 8,024 people in Trophy Club. The COG then estimated January 1st, based on known buildings, of 2014 at 10.1. 2015 estimate was 10.6, call it 10.7. They had an absolute change of 590 people that day. And that amazingly works out to 210 homes. So applying those same 210 homes to this year would give you a January of 2016 estimate of 11,280. Then I took 210 lots that are available left in the town at 2.8 people and added 580 persons. The urban residential in the PID, or in PD 30, excuse me, not the PID, PD 30, even if they were to do the construction on the ground floor, comes out at 283 units. Figuring 2 people per unit, that's another 546. There are 30 townhomes, 2 persons per townhome adds 60. So I get a population of 12,466 people at build-out. And I subtracted that from the 15,000 that we had as an estimate, come up short 2,534 people, or roughly 905 homes. We don't have room for 905 homes. Then I looked at the connections, and the current connections, the conditions slide shows the current connections at 4,517, the future at 6,383, expecting the 1,866 additional connections. Now, however, the elevated storage slide shows current connections at 4,173. But when you do the math, it too comes out at 4,517. Your packet for this evening shows a total of 4,531. So I took the 4,531, added the 210 lots, added the urban residential, added the townhomes, and come out with a total of 5,054 connections. So we're short from the projection of roughly 1,300 connections. So I too come out with, I think you have enough storage in your elevated tank. I was thinking as the discussion was going on, we have a 99-year agreement. And it would seem to me that that 99-year agreement would allow you to use that tank for your calculations for TCEQ. Could be wrong, just another approach. Looking at demand and looking at the line coming in. Once again, we get the population driver on the number required for the line. And I used the same numbers that the consultants use, and the 12,466 population requires a 3.56 million gallon day average, and we're talking about the current supply in that line of being at 3.7, so you're slightly under it. Now, as I looked at the presentation and also listened to the presentation, the question that I have is, what is that line capable of delivering? Because if it's capable of delivering enough water that if we were to run it 24 hours a day and put it in a tank, it would be a lot cheaper to build that tank than to put $14, $18 million in that line coming this way. So I think really, and as the consultant said, we don't think you can push that at 6.6 foot per second. But we need to know, or I think you need to know, exactly what that line's capable of doing, because that capability is what we're building and playing against. And then when we come to the elevated storage tank, and I'm not a hydraulic engineer, but it seems to me that the problem becomes keeping the tank full And if the problem is becoming keeping the tank full, and we've talked about adding pumps later because you may have a problem keeping the tank full, add the pumps up front and you keep the tank full. And you solve, in my mind, you solve that part of the equation. This line that's running between out here and that tank over there, I can see we're running that thing through, running that water through an 8-inch pipe out there someplace. Doesn't work. So it seems to me that that is a problem that needs to be resolved. Thank you, gentlemen.
Good. Thank you, Bill. We appreciate your input. Any other questions, any further discussion?
No, I think we just have to wait for the final report and updated numbers, and that way we can basically plan for the future and see what our options are. And that's the whole thing. Everything's on the table until we get all the data in and make projections for the future and see what other options we can do that'll be cost effective.
Okay. And we're talking hopefully the end of December for the final report, which means be probably January that we can look at this again. Is that a fair statement? Okay, let's move on. Item number 3, consider